Good evening. My name is Harriet O'Neill and I'm Assistant Director for the Fine Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the BSR. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the BSR Violence and Fascism series organised by John Foote and Simon Martin. John and Simon are going to introduce our speakers tonight, who will speak to the theme Everyday Violence. So that it remains for me to say welcome once again, to remind you that this event is being recorded and that we very much want you to engage with the discussion. And the best way of doing this is to type your question into the Q&A box. So thank you once again. And I shall become the BSR logo and hand over to John and Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to the BSR for hosting this. I think it's the 8th in the series that we started on 1921 at dintorni and on violence and fascism. So my name's John Foote, and I'm delighted to start off this event on everyday violence. We've got a really star lineup today in terms of this theme, and particularly important, both of them involved with this very important volume, I think, about sort of repositioning and rethinking history in general, but also history of Fascist Italy, which is called Outside the State, the Politics of Everyday Life in Fascist Italy, which is a collective volume which contains a number of thematic chapters applying this theories of everyday life and kind of practice of everyday life methodologies to Fascist Italy. But of course, you can apply those methodologies to many other periods of history. It doesn't have to be just Fascist Italy. So we have today with us Kate Ferris, who's Reader in Modern European History at the University of St Andrews. I'm not going to go through her long history of writing and publishing, because you have that already in your, you should have already seen the bio, but I particularly like to mention her book, Everyday Life in Fascist Venice, which is, again, a really, I think, important book about applying methodologies everyday life to everyday life in a particular space and place, and she's continued working in that area. She was involved in the volume I just mentioned as well, and has a massive project on comparative fascism ongoing, financed by the ERC. And Josh Arthurs, who's Associate Professor of Historical and Cultural Studies at the University of Toronto. He's the author of Excavating Modernity, the Roman Past in Fascist Italy, 2012, and is working on 1943 and the so-called 45 days between July and September. For those of you who haven't seen any other sort of editions of this series, the way we tend to organize them is kind of a conversation as opposed to any kind of formal presentations, and we ask our guests to kind of present their research in the first round, and then we start to talk about some of the questions relating to their research, relating to violence, relating to other issues about Italian fascism. Simon, do you want to add anything before we start going round?
No, not really. I think that's more or less covered. Just to say my thanks to Josh and Kate for being here. We were also going to say thanks to Michael as well, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, wasn't he? But we was also, our star panel was going to be even bigger, but he unfortunately couldn't make it. But we wish him well. But no, I think that's all I would like to add, really.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael Ebner, whose book Ordinary Violence in Mussolini's Italy is, I think, such an important book, such an underrated book, actually. Should have a much more wider circulation, and has been incredibly influential on my work in recent years. And so we say hello to Michael if he's listening, and wish him well. Okay, could I go first to Kate and then Josh, and say maybe you could talk a bit about your research, your ongoing research, and then kind of also start to talk about what you mean by everyday life and how you apply that to your own work.
Yes, sure. And thank you very much to the British School of Rome, and to John and to Simon for organising this. I'm looking forward to it. So I suppose, as you mentioned, I sort of came to everyday life history with my PhD, which started in 2001, and was interested in uncovering or sort of exploring more in depth about sort of everyday life, lived experience of dictatorship, specifically in Venice. And actually, I didn't start doing my PhD on that. I thought I was starting to do a PhD that was specifically engaged with questions of fascist racial policy and racism and popular attitudes to it. But I actually, as I kind of had a year at Foscari University and found myself kind of drawn to kind of a broader range of source materials that were really speaking to me about different aspects and dimensions of everyday life. And maybe I can talk about those, what those exactly were in a moment. From there, I suppose, so I finished my PhD, wrote the book on Venice, and then I guess sort of expanded the frame of my, or the parameters of the kind of aspects and spatial frame of everyday life that I was interested in, of course, with the book that Josh and Michael and I co-edited on the politics of everyday life, which takes a national frame. I guess I also expanded a little bit my interest, which had been developing particularly around forms of consumption and the way in which the regime tried to inflect and impose certain kinds of consumptive practices around food consumption, particularly thinking particularly around the moment of the League of Nations sanctions that were imposed in 1935, of course, in response to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, sovereign member state of the League of Nations, and the kind of drive, the sort of push that gave to an already underway kind of project of autarky. I've been expanding that kind of interest in consumption more recently through a project that I did the research for between 2015 and 2017, which was specifically around alcohol and bars and the way in which alcohol as a kind of as a lubricant and as a kind of the consumption of alcohol in bars as a space were kind of sort of lubricants and fuels for different kinds of political interactions under fascism, and how that maybe changed over the course of the dictatorship. And then I guess most recently, and sort of presently getting on to what I'm actually doing right now, that has developed into an interest in space and spatially framing the everyday. I think that's going to be the subject of my next book that I really need to start writing soon. I'm doing that under the kind of auspices of this ERC-funded project, which is a comparative history of everyday life and the lived experience of dictatorship in Southern Europe. So I'm working alongside 4 other postdoctoral and PhD researchers to investigate various different facets of the lived experience of the Salazar regime in Portugal, the Francoist regime in Spain, Fascist Italy, and in Greece, both the Metaxas regime and the colonel's dictatorship, some of those, of course. So that's kind of, that expands both the kind of geographical and also the sort of chronological remit of where I'm going. And that's been really fascinating. So that's sort of my potted history of my research to date. Should I perhaps talk a little bit more about what everyday life is to me? So I guess maybe I would start with, in the way that we do, we start our introduction to that to the co-edited volume. We start with Mussolini's maxim, that kind of very famous aphorism of totalitarian intent to rule, that everything should be, I'm paraphrasing, of course, everything should be within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And clearly, I mean, that's setting an intention to rule in a total way, and in a way that would necessarily therefore require a complete mobilization and a complete permeation of all facets of everyday life and Italian sort of Italian society. So for me, that maxim really brings everyday life in, it necessarily brings an everyday life perspective into the frame. I think if we want to understand how, you know, if the intent is to rule totally, then a measure of its evaluation must be to what extent are different facets of everyday life drawn into the sort of gaze of the fascist state. How far does the state permeate these? And what's really crucial for me, how do Italians themselves experience that kind of intent to rule totally? What kinds of options are open to them in terms of accepting, modifying, rejecting, everything in between those intents to rule totally. yeah, so it seems to me that once you know, if you start from that kind of intention to rule totally, and recognize therefore that the in order to do that, then, you know, the kind of fascist policies that are emanating from the centre, as it were, have to be put into practice in the various localities and in the everyday spaces that people inhabit and that they sort of traverse and cross in their day-to-day lives. These policies and rhetoric has to be enacted and perhaps reinterpreted by sort of local fascists on the ground, local party officials, police officers, teachers, journalists, midwives, etc., 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 health visitors, and so on. So therefore, I mean, it kind of amplifies a range of people involved in this project, and also, I think, amplifies the spaces that we should be looking at in terms of trying to understand how exactly is this project of fascism implemented and experienced, because it seems to me that it's therefore it's precisely in these everyday spaces and in the practices, these kind of leisure practices, recreation practices, the sort of interactions between family members and friends and so on. It's precisely in these spaces and within these practices that the dictatorship is also taking shape. And so that for me is why it's so important. Perhaps I should just leave it there and I can come on to sort of what everyday life might then actually mean, but I'll hand over to Josh perhaps.
Thank you very much. Just to say to the audience, if anytime you want to ask a question or make a point, just feel free anytime to put something in the Q&A. Josh.
Sure. No, thank you, and thank you for having me. So I came of scholarly age, I guess, as a historian of Fascist Italy, at a moment, particularly in North American historiography, that stressed culturalist approaches, the way that the fascist regime presented itself, the way that it expressed its vision of modernity, of Italian society, the way that it used visual culture and spectacle and ritual as part of that totalitarian project that Kate was referencing. I followed in that vein for my first book that John mentioned about Rome, and looking at how the regime presented itself through Rome, both rhetorically and spatially. But even then, I became particularly interested in looking at the production of meaning and the production of the regime's discourse on Rome, not simply looking at representational forms, Mussolini's speeches or museum exhibits, but also the role of archaeologists and scholars and sort of intellectual workers in producing that discourse. So I was already interested in kind of looking at the building of knowledge and discourse from the bottom up. I then spent some time working on and thinking about the afterlives of fascist monuments in the years since the war. And that led me to an interest in iconoclasm. And that took me to the immediate aftermath of the regime in July of 1943. And looking at how Italians on the day after Mussolini's ouster responded both in sort of very intimate personal terms. I look at diaries and letters, and I can certainly talk about that kind of work. I know that that's work that Kate has done as well, but also in very public ways, whether that was symbolic violence directed against various kinds of material culture identified with the regime, or against people identified as fascists. And one thing that I'm really interested in both kind of material violence and interpersonal violence is sort of how is fascism coded? Who constitutes a fascist, or what is a fascist monument in that moment? And that was meaning that was being generated, again, from below. That particular sites were identified as having been egregiously fascist, or particular individuals because of their role in the community who were charged as being the real fascist in town. So my interest in the everyday really stems, I think, from an interest in culture as a set of practices and behaviors and symbols. I've done quite a lot of coursework in graduate school in anthropology, and also read sort of social interactionist theory, people like Irving Goffman, the rules, the regulations, the routines that define how we speak with one another, the gestures we use, the things that govern our interactions. And so, to me, in many ways, both the fascist order, when the regime was in power, and the upheaval that happens in the wake of the regime's collapse, I think both of those, to me, are symbolic events. They occur in a kind of symbolic universe that people have to navigate in the course of their everyday lives. I just wrote an article on the role of the distintivo, the party badge that all fascist party members would wear, and what that would broadcast about you, how it would affect how other people related to you, and that this constituted the fascist order on the ground in the way that Kate is describing as well. That it's not simply that these were echoes of dictates from above or things that filtered down, but that the way that most people experienced fascism was by coming into contact with someone wearing a lapel pin, and using that to get to the front of the food line, or who could bully somebody in the street with impunity because they were well connected. Again, my interest is in this sort of cultural and anthropological understanding of the everyday, that understands the everyday as a set of symbols, vocabularies, spaces that people make meaning of.
Thank you to both of you. I think I'm going to come back round again on this. I think I wondered about a couple of other connections with everyday life theory and practice and methodology. It seems to me that there's a question of scale as well. So much of fascist history has been told through Mussolini, the hierarchy from above, and there's everyday life is practice and methodology and history is turning that around, but it's not just, it's also making it smaller. So I think I wondered if you'd agree with this, there's a kind of natural marriage between everyday life history and microhistory, which is something that emerged in Italy in the 70s in opposition to the kind of grand theories of history, Marxism, liberalism, and so on. So I wonder what you think about scale, and also about the alternative sources, which Josh has kind of mentioned and Kate's mentioned, but like maybe you could say a bit more about that. So I think the other natural marriage is with oral history, and seems to me they're working on a very similar set of assumptions about subjectivities and space and memory, and they kind of work together very well. So those kind of three levels: microhistory, everyday life, and oral history. And do you see in your work these similar connections? Do you like, I like working in a very small scale, like a room or a housing block, and that's too big already. I've always liked that idea of something really micro, or an event, one event or one moment. So those are kind of and just one other kind of sub question is, one of the criticisms of everyday life theory is that it's really not, it's how can you extrapolate from, one guy in a bar getting beaten up in Venice in 1923, or one monument being knocked down in Rome in July, 25th of July. How can you extrapolate from that to the big questions? I mean, I'm not troubled by that criticism, but it is a criticism that often made. So I wonder if, when you're thinking about what I've said, you could also have a go at that question as well. We'll go the same way around. So if we go to Kate first, and Simon, come in whenever you want as well, obviously.
Yeah, so I really like working with small scale as well. It's it feels it's a very human scale, and I think I really enjoy that, and putting it together and seeing how different human scales, different individual scales or neighborhoods or whatever connect. That's a lot to think about. And so maybe starting with microhistory, absolutely. I think, so for me, maybe I should have said that when I was kind of grappling with, or when I was starting to work with them, and being interested in asking certain kinds of questions, because actually for me, I think everyday life history is more an approach, and it's a set of questions that you ask of your sources, and it's a set of questions rather than another criticism that was often leveled at the kind of early sort of Alltagsgeschichte historians, the kind of West German and then sort of United Germany historians who were working on the history of the Nazi past. And one of the kind of criticisms that was leveled at them was that that what is it anyway, and what is everyday life, and for me, so is it something that happens every single day? Does it are we talking about the mundane, the repeated, the kind of infraordinary stuff that Jo Moran describes, or are we talking about something else? And for me, we are talking about something else. I think we're talking about a way of approaching sources and a kind of set of questions around subjectivity, around agency, around practice, around connections between the extraordinary and the ordinary, and so maybe I should come back to those, because I feel like I'm going too far from your specific question. But yeah, when I first started kind of trying to apply everyday life, or to think about the sources that I encountered in Venice, when I was trying to kind of think about how am I going to ask these questions, I mean, immediately what came to me was my sort of familiarity with Carlo Ginzburg from undergraduate years, and The Cheese and the Worms, and the way he, the kind of creative processes that he identifies in Menocchio, and also coming back to scale, the work of Jacques Revel on playing with scale. And for me, that's really crucial. So, I mean, for me, it is absolutely about a micro scale, about looking very small and using a very small scale to ask some very big questions. But it's also about kind of playing with those scales, i.e. moving between them. So being able to kind of, you have to find some way of kind of connecting what happens to an individual, or it's something that happens on a particular factory floor on a particular day in 1928, say, or what happens in the Rialto marketplace in 1935, and an interaction between a kind of butcher and a female housewife, as it were. You've got to be able to connect those things to something bigger, both connect with the kind of practices that other people are engaging with, and also with the policies that are being enacted by the regime. And how those are kind of being implemented and so on. So for me, it's kind of, yeah, absolutely playing with scales. And I think microhistory, therefore, is both in that sort of sense of playing with scale, and Carlo Ginzburg's, everything that Carlo Ginzburg says in terms of working with what's exceptional and what's typical. So figuring out what are the parameters. That's another really important question that I think I'm asking of my sources. What are actually the parameters of possible behavior? What are the parameters of possible thought and action and so on within this particular context, in this case of fascist dictatorship? So yeah, I think Ginzburg's work becomes really helpful there. I mean, I think the Alltagsgeschichte historians are obviously, relatively running in parallel chronologically to microhistory, and you can see, I think, in both of them kind of influences of history from below in the British sort of left-wing radical post-war history tradition and so on. So I think all of these things, as well as some of the kind of interdisciplinary influences, as Josh was saying, I mean, there's so much that comes, I think, from anthropology, and I find myself learning from political scientists and so on and so forth. It's yeah, I think it's very much a kind of an approach that sits at the intersection of disciplines, but also is kind of very much influenced by various different historiographical traditions and sort of developments. Shall I? Do you want to come on that?
No,
Josh?
I just echo. I guess to start with, I just on the microhistory question, I would echo Kate's point about the movement between scales. I don't think of what I'm doing right now as microhistory, insofar as I'm using a very small tranche of time. I'm sort of using chronology as a very as a limiting factor by looking at this 45-day period. But I am looking at a national scale. But I'm doing it I think, Kate, I can't remember if this is your phrase or a quote you have used, but the idea of a collage of miniatures, right?
It's Alf Ludke. It's not my.
Alf Ludke, right? Of course, it's Alf Ludke, right? So I think that idea of a collage of miniatures is important to me. The way in which these many microscopic stories are pieced together to form a whole, and particularly because at least much of the evidence that I'm looking at is very fractured. It's very incomplete. That I might be looking at a police report of one particular fight in the streets, and that's as much as I can really track down about that episode. And so, rather than being able to do a Ginsburg-style kind of deep dive into that one interaction, I find many such interactions in very different contexts across the peninsula. And it's the replicability of those kinds of interactions that tells me that there's a there. So I think it's often about piecing together these little snapshots as much as fleshing out one particular account based on, let's say, if we take Cheese and the Worms as our paradigm, one particular trial that has a particularly rich documentary record.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. Absolutely. It's a sort of a necessarily fragmented source space, isn't it? And you kind of have to just lean into that in a way. You have to, you certainly have to accept that maybe you don't know what happens in a particular court case. You don't know what happens after, or a diary might not tell you the before and after that. You only just, you wish, oh, I wish they would just tell me that. And you just have to lean into it. And as you say, you kind of use this. I think this comes back to the point that you're making, John, about not being troubled by the fact that you're looking at one fight in a particular case or whatever. And I agree, I'm not troubled by that either. Also because you're kind of putting together this collage of miniatures. So by laying one particular fight or laying one particular kind of interaction that's reported in a police report or is kind of documented in a memoir or whatever it might be, you're laying that alongside several others that might not be the same. Of course, they're not the same because each individual human interaction is necessarily unique, happening in a particular time and place and set of circumstances. But there's enough, you build a picture that whereby either a certain type of mode of behavior or a certain type of interaction or a kind of certain tactic or a certain, now I'm starting to use the kind of the sort of conceptual tools that I think everyday life historians use. You see kind of evidence of maneuvering or evidence of what Luisa Passerini calls mediation. And so you then put those all together, and that in a way allows you to see what's exceptional, allows you to see what's normative, what's not normative, where you can follow the clues. And sometimes that's taken me in kind of strange directions or directions that, or I've discovered that what I thought was an anomaly actually turns out not to be an anomaly. That certainly happened to me with the kind of the spark that set off my interest in bars and alcohol that maybe I can come back to. But, I thought I was following a clue of something that was really interesting in the way in which people used alcohol as a kind of tactic to get out of being, to get themselves out of trouble. If they'd said something or sang something that they shouldn't have, and they'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was drunk." And I thought that was that was really interesting. And then I suppose it turned out to be actually really quite common. But I think that's one of the ways in which you can start to kind of build this collage and use it to really explore the kind of questions that are interesting, like the relationship between what's extraordinary and what's ordinary, and what actually happens to that in dictatorship, where effectively over time and for certainly for younger Italians, arguably dictatorship becomes the norm. So I think you can see how you can start to ask the kind of questions that we're interested in asking of the sources when you start kind of putting them together and using these kind of analytical tools to kind of make comparisons or connections, at least, between things that might seem quite disparate and fragmentary and small.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, do you want to
well, I was. You had also asked about oral history, so I was going to touch on that, and that is certainly something that I'm drawing on. Although right now I'm using more oral histories that others have collected. I haven't conducted oral histories myself for this project as yet. I think, again, there is clearly an important connection there. Obviously, the big methodological challenge is sort of remembering that with oral histories, you were ultimately really learning more about the subjective way in which someone is narrating their experience retrospectively, rather than a kind of an intact trace of the past that is being communicated. And particularly given that what I'm interested in my current project is how people understood July 25th as an event, how they made it into a kind of a punctuating moment in their lives. Oral histories are extremely useful. One collection I used was the University of Southern California has a huge collection of oral histories from Holocaust survivors, which are searchable by geography. And I just watched all the collected oral histories from Italian Jews, and it was so striking to me that when they were asked about July 25th, the first thing that happened invariably was a big smile broke out on their faces, and they were recollecting this kind of chaotic, euphoric, carnivalesque moment, and that certainly jives with contemporary sources that I have from that era. But it also speaks to a kind of narrative that then, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, sort of has been constructed, which is that there was this moment of hope, of euphoria, which then only 45 days later is revealed to be a false dawn, is a moment of greater disaster with the armistice and the occupation of Italy by the Germans. So I think what we get with oral histories is that, you know, what I guess they now call ego documents, is this ability to see how people are narrating events to themselves. And in some senses, even contemporary sources have that same function. I think Alessandro Postelli makes this point, this important point, is even written sources that we consider more reliable than oral history sources are themselves transcripts, right? The records of an interrogation or a trial are transcripts of utterances, and so for that reason, I think oral histories are just as valid as a primary source.
The archives are absolutely full of transcriptions of meetings, and they're almost huge amounts of oral history, especially 20th, 21st century stuff. I mean, I'd also add that there's also the importance of nothing happening. I think everyday life also allows for that. Everyday life history, it allows for the mundane and the banal to become part of history, which is what most happens to most people most of the time. Is there not, they get it, but that's why it's called everyday life. They go about their lives and nothing really happens. And I think that is also interesting. Particularly when you then touching on the massive debates about fascism and consensus and so on. So that I'm sure we'll come back to that. I think a lot of this there's some amazing work being produced using these methodologies. I just cite Mark Seymour's recent book on emotional arenas, which is a microhistory of a trial, which is a fantastic application of various types of these methodologies. And something that was very influential on me about nothing really happening, but something very important happening, was the chapter in Luisa Passerini's book about fascism, about the silence of the Fiat workers when Mussolini comes to speak in 1939 in Mirafiori, and they don't clap him. There's something they didn't do, but it was just as he knew exactly what that meant. But it was a non-thing. It was a silence. So that, I think those, it allows us to go in so many different directions. I'd like to come to violence. Perhaps we could start in the sort of, Squadristi period, and then we could move to 43 or whenever we want to go. If we start with thinking about Squadrismo, but also post-Squadrismo, could our guests think about everyday violence? So, you know, we know about Matteotti and we know about the big moments of violence in Squadristi history, in that moment of the rise to power of fascism. What about other kinds of, like, you know, normal everyday violence? Could we talk a bit? Would you both be able to say something about that? And that also links to, after you've spoken, there's a question which kind of touches very much on that issue as well. So I'll read that out. So let's go the same way. And again, Simon, if you want to come in, just come in. So Kate, go for it.
Yeah, sure. I suppose I definitely can say something about my more recent research about Squadrista violence and the violence kind of before and after the March on Rome in relation to bars and alcohol. But maybe just first, I guess I would definitely say, because I think, I mean, arguably, I mean, what you're saying about nothing happening just there, I mean, I think that again is one of another kind of major question for me is kind of how present is the state and how present is violence, so on, and when are the moments in which it's more present and when is it less present? And, you know, of course, it's all, I mean, that's certainly not in any way intended to downplay or underplay the extent to which clearly physical political violence was a key kind of facet of the experience of fascism, and I think that, and you know, it might have its kind of heyday in the 1920s to kind of the consolidation of the dictatorship in the mid 1920s or so on, but you know, maybe is reined in a little, but of course, but it's effectively, as you know, as others have said far more eloquently and knowledgeably than me, it's clearly redirected to the colonies. It's redirected to Spain in 1936. It comes out in occupation in the domestic policies after 1938 and so on. But I guess I would have a plea also for kind of having within it, within our understanding of everyday violence, also those forms of maybe less overt, maybe less physical kind of enactment of violence by one person upon another, or by the state upon a person, and maybe kind of, again, I don't think, I mean, this is something that Michael Ebner makes really clear in his fantastic book, but, you know, that also within our kind of understanding of violence and everyday violence, we have to kind of include the kind of the expansion, the kind of criminalization of different forms of speech acts and different kinds of activities that, you know, pre-1926, pre-1930s, in the case of some of the kind of sort of the laws around the offending, the duce and so on, you know, the jokes and so on that you know, become criminalized. So that's also, you know, the disciplining of that, the kind of the surveillance of that, the policing of bodies, the policing of behaviors, of kind of relationships between Italians, the silencing of you know, kind of removal of the apparatus of forms of expression with the consolidation of the dictatorship, kind of imposition of censorship, but also self-censorship, and people, and that kind of climate of fear and oppression, the kind of disciplining of bodies in different ways, kind of denial of bodily autonomy to women through the enactment of acts around abortion and around contraception and so on, the kind of added kind of oppression and denial of right to exist in the way in which one might want to, for those people whose identities or their ethnicity or their sexuality or their occupation, thinking of sex workers, for example, you know, or the lack of occupation, thinking of how vagrants are treated. I mean, the kind of so for me, I would be having a plea to kind of include all of that in our understanding of everyday violence, and in the way that it was, you know, and the kind of, as well, the sort of the duality of the sort of policy, you know, if fascism is kind of ruling in this kind of, on the one hand, trying to entice people and persuade them with kind of the OND and with welfare provision and so on, and on the other hand repressing them. But I mean, both of those clearly have significant interplay, and I think Paul Corner has shown in really interesting ways how welfare is kind of, the kind of denial of access to work, denial of access to welfare, or regulation of access to work and welfare is used also again as a disciplining tool, and to me that's a form of violence. But just coming back to the Squadrista violence, and insofar as my work has touched on it, I think it would be within my project on bars and alcohol, and one of the things that I was interested there, and again I think, for example, Michael Ebner has shown how bars very often were the location, were the venue for political violence, both before and after the March on Rome, and others have shown that too. So that's nothing new. And I mean, but just one of the questions that I was wanting to ask about that when I was trying to kind of more just systematically understand how does alcohol function, how do bars as spaces of kind of practice and political sociability, how do they actually function? And so specifically with political violence pre and post March on Rome, what I found was lots of evidence from diaries, from police records, from memoirs and so on, both of fascists and of anti-fascists, and non-fascist, or people who were not affiliated particularly, didn't see themselves necessarily in those terms. Lots of evidence of talking about how particular bars were targeted, how fascist Squadristi would target particular bars, would go to particular working class areas of Venice, say on Via Garibaldi, in order to kind of go and provoke by drinking, and by kind of singing RDT songs and so on, to kind of get a rise out of the local population, but also other kind of memoirs that spoke to some of the kind of nuances of that. There's a diary in the National Diary Archive in Pieve Santo Stefano of someone whose father was the sort of manager of the cantina, the sort of socialist cantina in Frascati, and he describes how with the kind of Sunday punishment expeditions and the arrival into town of the kind of local squad, with a purpose of enacting violence, that his father's cantina, of course, had to shut, the local osteria had to shut, but the two kind of cafe in the piazza that had a more middle class clientele, merrily kind of remained open, and their patrons drinking their coffees and whatever. Meanwhile, the Sunday punishment expedition is ongoing. I mean, the other thing that I found as well, which I don't particularly think is necessarily surprising, or might not be anything new, but the way in which alcohol really bookended these expeditions and the political violence in those years, so very often violence was a trigger, in the sense, drinking was a trigger in that, it was purpose. So it was perhaps the violence came as a result of patrons at the same establishment coming to blows because overhearing or political conversations. So drinking could be the trigger, but also in a more ritualistic way. It seems to me that drinking bookended the violence very often. I mean, I see lots of evidence in the sources of drinking as purposely drinking alcohol before enacting violence, and then purposely kind of going to a local bar. And this again is from the diary of, I'm thinking of particularly the one from Frascati, where he talks about how Sunday punishment expedition completed, the fascist squad kind of repaired to a nearby bar and demanded free alcohol, and then threatened the bar owner with violence if he didn't acquiesce to that. So yeah, I mean, for me, that's where I've been in terms of kind of sort of filling out some of this picture of Squadrista violence and how it kind of actually functions in certain spaces, although of course there are many other spaces besides bars in which that violence is enacted.
Thank you very much. Josh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess for one thing, I would echo Kate's bringing up Michael's work, and to me, some of the sections that are most striking, no pun intended, are those that deal with sort of the way that small acts of violence pervaded everyday life, that it would not be uncommon for a militiaman in uniform just to slap somebody or spit on them in the street. That kind of microscopic violence, which we don't, when we think about totalitarian violence, we always think about Gestapo and sort of kind of state-driven macroscopic violence. But that microscopic violence, I think, has a lot to do with kind of policing the social order of fascist Italy on a daily basis. That intimidation was hugely important to the fascists. And I think that then connects back to Squadrismo. That's certainly something that is very interesting to me. And I know Matteo Milan wrote about this in our volume, and John, I know you've looked at similar kinds of cases, how ritualized and how comical sometimes Squadrista violence was supposed to be, that it aimed at humiliation, it aimed at mockery, at feminization of political opponents, the shaving of beards, the castor oil, the club, that there was this humiliating, and then also this sort of idea of kind of educative violence, right? That, don't do it again. I'm giving, this is meant to be an example both to the individual who's being assaulted, but probably even more to the audience, the onlookers of acts of violence. Again, it's that kind of spectacular, symbolic dimension is interesting to me. And then where it's come up in my own research is that in many, many occasions that I've been looking at in 1943, there is an explicit tie to violence from the Squadrista period, that it is this inversion, this, I keep finding the phrase, ripagare con la stessa moneta, of sort of, paying back exactly the same way that you were tortured 20 years earlier. And so people will dredge up, first of all, very kind of intimate personal grievances about how this Squadrista lorded it over everyone, or once he got to be the local agricultural commissioner, he didn't let me have a tractor, or he took my girl, or whatever, right? All of these kind of quotidian concerns, that is tied to forms of violence, and the kind of the figure of the Squadrista, the ideal type, is above all an arrogant bully, and then has to be kind of treated as such once he has been deprived of the kind of protection of his black shirt. And so you see the very same acts of symbolic humiliation being meted out on fascists in 1943. And so fascist violence is a kind of vocabulary that Italians understand and speak, and then they know how to use it back against fascists afterwards.
I'd also say that I'm working on the 70s now. A lot of that is recreated again in that period. Also in the clashes between fascists and anti-fascists, and some of the forms of violence. I think there's really interesting interventions. What came to I wanted to just add another layer, which was the invasion of everyday space by Squadrismo. I'm thinking of some of the descriptions of some of the rural violence, where the Squadristi turn up at night, to an isolated farmhouse, they invade the private space of families, and kill the man in front of the family. Sometimes there's rape involved here. As this whole, the private space is no longer safe, and that's that thing about the lesson, which again it comes out in the 70s. It's almost Maoist, isn't it? Colpirne uno per educarne cento, which is what the Brigatisti said in the 70s, is what the fascists are doing. We're going to take out the Capolega of this trade union in this way, and you better not join the union, you better leave the union. And, they're going to be exiled. I mean, their life will change like that. And their house will not be a safe place anymore. So this everyday space, this violence is it's very personal sometimes. It's people who know each other. Might have some grudge. There's been some really interesting work on that the motivations behind some of the violence. They might be people who've been, you know, slighted before for other reasons. Something really kind of almost kind of not modern about it, but also modern at the same time. The Squadristi are clearly modern, but they're not modern as well. And then
that's what really that's what people, from many people, thought fascism was. It was that sum total of grievances and daily slights. I think it wasn't, you know, palingenetic ultranationalism. It wasn't the new man. It was that I mean, if you think about some of the filmic representations of fascism, if you think of Novecento, right, where there are these sort of, you know, the entrenched authorities kind of just change shirt color in order to, you know, to maintain kind of elite power, and that the same bullies are there before fascism and then essentially take over with fascism. I think that is true to a lot of lived experiences. And you mentioned space. I found that there was a lot of storming of Case del Fascio, of Fascist Party headquarters, especially ones that had previously been Case del Popolo, had been leftist party headquarters, and that had been stormed in 1921. And the contents had been thrown out in the street and burned, and the red flags had been burned. And then they do the exact same thing in 1943. And they claim even sometimes that they found old red flags hidden under the floorboards, or they claim that they found caches of the rings that were collected for the Ethiopian War, or boxes of explosive pens that were supposed to have been dropped by the Allies, and this revealed that in fact it had been the fascists who planted them all along. So again, this sort of the way that people narrate what fascism had been through their actions, I think again it reveals much more what fascism meant to people, what they considered fascism to have been, than any kind of grand vision presented by the regime.
Yeah, and the destruction of space. So fascism destroys the spaces constructed over years by socialism and the trade union. It completely destroys them overnight, just burns them down. And that is a traumatic memory that is carried forward for 20 years. I think that destruction of something you've built as well, it's a very visceral thing. And the reduction to silence, I think, isn't just the last thing I'd add. I think it was Maurizio Gribaldi's book on Turin, Microhistory of Turin, Borgo San Paolo. But what he said was what fascism did, you couldn't even talk about change anymore. And that's a very, very powerful thing, isn't it? And I think that just brings me, I just want to refer to the first question that came in, because I hope you can see that, but I think Peter Williamson makes a very good points about how how violence functioned as a warning. And then after that, particularly after that first period of 2021, 22, then that explosive period, it's always there, but they don't need to use it so much anymore in that way. And in fact, it's almost frowned upon because it's not particularly politically, tactically good, but it's always there, it's always ready. I think that's that question makes some very good points about, and I think we not the audience can't see it. So there's a question talking about whether violence was most effective as a threat, and also about the conditioning of behavior. And I think those are really interesting points, and those are kind of things that everyday life can get to that perhaps you can't get to if you're talking in a different way about fascism or just talking about fascists. So yeah,
could I just come in? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point that what's the effect of kind of violence done to others, and I think, as is said, as Paul kind of shown, that that kind of violence done to others has an impact of kind of creating a climate of fear and you know, it's part of what he talks when he's talking about the kind of the way in which Italians learn to live within the limits imposed upon them. You know, that's part of the setting of those limits, of course. At the same time, I've always been really struck by something that Julia Albanese wrote in the chapter in the on violence and the sort of early violence in the Society of Fascists book that she co-edited with Roberta Perga, because in there she writes about how violence done to others functions in a different but very interesting way in a sort of everyday setting, which actually chimes in some ways with what Luisa Passerini writes. So she talks about how, you know, that kind of approval of violence done to others. So for those people who were not sympathetic to the left and were not sympathetic to socialists and communists, and for those people who, you know, the kind of people that Luisa Passerini writes about and has interviewed, who talked about kind of their sort of approval, the kind of social acceptance and the approval of the kind of the law and order side of the idea that fascism then, you know, once it's unleashed its violence, restores order and so on. And there, I think both of them are writing in a different way about the impact of violence done to others, which I find really fascinating, because it's a kind of it's different in different ways, people approving of violence being enacted on others.
And it even allows the fascists themselves to stake out a position when they crack down on fascist violence. That there's always this double game played by the party. This is in Paul Corner's research, but even thinking about things like the Matteotti affair, where fascist violence has its instrumental purpose, and then the party or the leadership can make a show of disciplining their rowdy members, thereby showing who's really in control, and the levers of law and order are ultimately controlled at the top.
And also from the point of view of everyday life, the Squadristi, I think, are very interesting because violence was such a key part of their identity. It's what bound them together in those groups. And then when that was sort of toned down, they found it very difficult to, I mean, some of them go straight into the regime, obviously, but that sort of, you know, those incredible years when they're at, that's what they do. They are Squadristi. That's their job. They don't really have another job. That is their job. It's an amazing, I think that is a little bit being understudied, that identity of the Squadristi in themselves, that kind of everyday. And it's kind of what Kate was talking about, the bars and the spaces and of the Squadristi it's one of the most amazing movements in 20th century history, I think, in the terms of its effectiveness and its kind of absolute refusal to accept any limits in that period, when it's particularly in 21. You know, that the things that happen are mind-blowing if you go back and read them. And just on the kind of the acceptance of violence that Kate brought up, I found it really interesting reading back the newspapers like Corriere della Sera in that period. You find that Corriere is basically saying, yeah, this violence is all right. You know, they kind of deserve it. You know, when someone like Miziano, who's the kind of epitome of the deserter, his house gets surrounded by 200 black shirts and he has to run for his life. The way they report it is like it's a joke. It's like a funny incident. I mean, it's not funny for him. I don't know who it's funny for, but it's sort of, there was a terrible moral vacuum at that point in terms of violence. And I wonder, and this brings us on to 43 and perhaps on to 45, I wonder how long, and also to the 70s, you know, there's David Forgacci's book about violence just come out, about violence right through a violent kind of Italian century. I wonder if we could move on to that period 43, 45 and think about what everyday life does for us there, how it helps us understand that period of civil war and, you know, almost daily. I mean, there's war, taking out the war side of things, but the civil war aspects, which Josh has talked about, I wonder what we can think about how everyday life methodologies help us in that way to understand what's going on. Does anyone want to? Who wants to start on that? Okay. Well, Josh, you go first.
Yeah. I mean, just because I spend all my every day in 1943 these days. So, I mean, in the 45-day period, I think that sort of everyday life is fundamentally the space where Italians are trying to figure out what's happening next. This is really a liminal period, and there's this huge aspiration for normalcy more than anything else. This is a period that really predates the mobilization of the resistance. The resistance is kind of in disarray, or anti-fascist parties are in disarray in the wake of July 25th. And so, even though kind of in constructing resistance memory after the fact, there's been this attempt to write the history of the 45 days as the anticipation of the resistance. Really, it's not a kind of largely a story of political parties at that moment. It's a story of people trying to put the pieces back together and anticipate what's coming next, and this huge, desperate desire for peace and normalcy. Once we get to the to the Civil War period, 43-45. I mean, I really tend to feel that the radicalization of violence in that period represents something new and is fundamentally a dynamic created by the experience of occupation and collaboration. The violence in Italy looks a lot more like it does in other parts of Europe that had been under Nazi occupation at that period. And so I think that that's a whole other dimension that has to be added. In some ways, I always wonder when we talk about civil war, if we leave out the Germans too often. It is treated as an entirely Italian affair. But Salo is, for me, fundamentally not a fascist regime. It is a Nazi puppet regime, and one that you can understand the radicalization of violence through that lens, and that had everyday consequences too for the people for the communities that were trapped, particularly in rural areas, between the resistance and the collaborationist forces.
Thank you. Kate, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I guess in some ways, I don't have a great deal that I can say in this, other than a methodological point that I maybe make in the. So, I mean, most of my research is always on the bits in between, the sort of bits that go really from 1925 to 1940. I'm always kind of just stopping in 1940 because I feel like things change so much. But in a way, I don't think it's any surprise that we've been talking about 1921. I mean, obviously it's a point, but we've been talking about the beginning, and then we're talking about 43 and the 45 days. And for me, this comes to the methodological point that I was thought I'd just draw back in. Again, I guess maybe it comes back to Ginsberg actually, and but also actually to Michel de Certeau is another theorist that we haven't mentioned, who's I guess kind of the guru of everyday life theory. And both of them talk about looking at the margins, especially Michel de Certeau talks about looking at the margins. And I've been reading a political scientist, Fox, recently. Who was I'm not sure I take on board absolutely everything that he's writing, certainly because he seems to think that everyday life is about things that happen unconsciously and unreflexively, and that's absolutely not the way that I would think about everyday life history. But what he does do is talk about the edges, and so I think those kind of margins and edges, those are these kind of temporal edges of the dictatorship, both in the kind of early 1920s and then from 1943, really, as Josh was saying, as he showed, these 43 is a moment in which in which fascism becomes past, of course, and but I think those edges, those kind of like moments of creation and of kind of destabilization, are so important. Among other edges, we can look at other kind of edges of the dictatorship to try and understand kind of what's normal, what's not normal, and they might be spatial edges, there might be other kinds of political edges, but I think those temporal edges are really fruitful places to look and just kind of bringing it like connecting back to what was said about oral history as well, I can well imagine how very fruitful it must be to use kind of oral history testimony, particularly to look at these kind of edges, because I certainly know from the this kind of bigger comparative project that I'm doing at the moment, my colleague Hugh Halstead, who's working on the Greek case and is essentially using oral history testimony and methodology, and so many of his, in a very unstructured interview, his interviewees, his interlocutors, so often come to the moment at which, for them, the dictatorship arrived, and the moment for them when the dictatorship ended, and that might become, that might be different days. In the Greek kind of hinterlands or the islands, the dictatorship perhaps came a few days later than it did in Athens. But I mean, it's just so formative, isn't it? And so therefore, it's just such a fruitful and important place to look to, not just to understand those days themselves, but to understand so much more about how the dictatorship was lived. So that, I think that's all I can add, but not from my own research at all.
I think there's all this importance of in the everyday kind of sphere and space of overturnings, but also continuities. I mean, there's all these stories that I read of, I think they're in oral histories, of suddenly the Mussolini portrait disappears and the Matteotti portrait goes up. That fantastic description of Pertini, who is in, I think, Civitavecchia or somewhere in Confino. And he goes and he marches in,
I think, yeah.
marches into the office of the, completely like taking control of the office of the head of the Confino, and suddenly notices the king's already come down from the wall. It's like the speed of it, that moment of change. And then that's what Josh has been talking about. I would just like I think the role of memories in terms of the violence is something that really interests me. Who's attacked, why, when, and that, that to trace that, you could do it. I think that's the work that Josh is doing in July, but you could also obviously do that with the Resa dei Conti after liberation and see who's attacked, why, when. And it generally isn't a spontaneous, a kind of random violence, but a very, very targeted. I mean, there are elements of random violence, but if you look at the actual people who are attacked, who by, it's extremely planned, not planned, but this is a story from my own time in Milan, but the two partisans I knew quite well in the area I lived in, they wouldn't really talk about what happened in 45, but they'd say, oh yeah, we took the two people who really run the show, and we took them behind a wall and we killed them. We didn't kill a lot of people, we killed those two. That was payback for fascism. We didn't just randomly kill people who were in the lower level of fascism. We killed those two. I think that's really interesting, that role of memory and politics in the violence of the Resa dei Conti, which is a kind of understudied period.
Or even I've been working on a little bit about the 45 days about the role of the press, and how there was a few weeks where the press was instructed essentially to pick out some fascist bad apples and highlight them to the general public, because the Badoglio government was not undertaking a comprehensive defascistization program, but they wanted to show that they were doing something. And one figure that they really lit on was Clara Petacci, who at that point would have been unknown to most Italians. But there was about a week worth of salacious articles that were essentially published verbatim, reproductions in all the major newspapers that kind of told this whole story and set her up as this kind of, fascist Marie Antoinette. And I think there's a direct tie between the kind of story of Petacci that was told in 1943 and then her fate in 1945. And you have a lot of episodes like that, I think.
It's so fascinating, that moment. But I've just read an amazing book about Montanelli, the journalist in 43, 44, and he's busy reinventing himself. And he writes all these anti-fascist articles. And then they didn't think that 8th of September was going to come round. and then they're suddenly trying to reinvent themselves again the other way because they've gone to, but this stuff has already come out. It's just an amazing moment. It's a fantastic book, actually. I really recommend it. Passaggio in Svizzera. It's a really, really interesting kind of detailed microhistory of that one man in one place at one time. I'd just like to just finish off by asking the second question, and we could do a round on that. This is from Alessio Ponzio, and he's asking about everyday life and sources. And I suppose we've spoken quite a lot about newspapers and archives, but he's asking about novels, cinema, other forms of cultural artifacts in under the regime, and their use in kind of understanding the everyday. So I wonder if Kate and Josh could comment on that. So sources beyond kind of the archive, as it were. It doesn't have to be the ones that he's mentioned, but I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. Let's start with Kate again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they are really important for different, and can be used in different ways. I mean, I guess if we're, I mean, yeah, we have our archival sources, we have the archival sources, so we might use them. And of course, so many of those are effectively officially produced sources, police records and so on. And I know that when I was doing my PhD, for example, I was really resistant to using those. I've come around a bit now. I think, of course, very often I've come around almost entirely, in fact. I mean, they have to be, obviously they have to sometimes read against the grain. We've talked already, we have to read the silences and try and understand some of the silences and absences in those sources. And then you have the ego documents alongside those kind of more officially produced sources, those kind of police records, those newspaper articles and so on and so, policy documents, etc., etc. We have ego documents that, often are written after the event, sometimes the diaries and letters that were written contemporaneous. And then I think it is really vital to use those kind of broader sources of I mean, certainly I've used film. I've been working quite a lot on dancing recently, actually, as well as bars, and I've gone from bars to dancing. So being interested in what people were dancing to, the kind of what music they were listening to, and so on. Been certainly using novels since I started. I mean, I think so. On the one hand, you might use them. You could say, okay, you're using them to fill out your picture, to understand the kind of, to kind of get at, what Carlo Ginzburg's kind of parameters of culture, that is part of kind of understanding what kinds of worldviews, what kind of behaviors were possible. I mean, if they're novels or cinematic representations, we're not talking about things that necessarily actually happened, but then, as we've said, I mean, all of those other archival sources, police records and so on, are narratives effectively. The witness statements, the police reports, the oral history, of course. I mean, the memoirs, they're all narratives and in some way involve a process of selection and therefore construction. So I think we can certainly use those sources in that way. But for me also, I mean, certainly I can think of, using some of D'Annunzio's work, for example, when I was trying to better understand sort of practices and attitudes towards death and funeral rituals in Venice, and trying to understand, well, what might that, what are the kind of what kind of mentality, what kinds of ways of thinking about death, what kinds of ways of thinking about sort of loss and grief are there, and I think therefore, those are really important sources. One of the other things for me as well, and this comes to the cinematic production and for example, some of the sort of music discs that I've been using, is that for me, they speak very clearly to some of the limits of these. We start off talking about the regime's intent to rule totally, and part of that involved sort of insisting on a kind of very on Italianization and the kind of primacy of Italian cultural forms, of Italian ways of watching films, of dancing to music. And so therefore those kinds of sources, then cinematic productions from Hollywood, or music that comes perhaps from Latin America or the Caribbean, but via US recording companies and so on, those speak to some of the limits actually of the regime's reach, and the extent to which the regime's not always able to limit and control the circulation of cultural artifacts in the way in which it might have hoped. So I think there are lots of ways, basically, in which we might use those kinds of sources.
And I guess I would just add that many cultural artifacts from the fascist period are also prescriptive, and that includes prescriptive representations of everyday life. So that there are, Luce newsreels or posters or initiatives for young people or women. These are all part of a kind of dialectic between the state and the Italian people. And I think what Kate and I and the other contributors to that volume really emphasized was that there's a process of kind of filtering, of appropriation, of playing with those imperatives from those formal representations. And so whether it's how you wear your black shirt, or I know Kate's done work in her Venice book about recipes, right? About sort of how does a good housewife deal with League of Nations sanctions, and how does that affect what she serves her family, those kinds of things. That I think essential to everyday life is it is not just sort of a kind of only a history from below. It's a bidirectional one from above and below, and that those kind of cultural artifacts help us understand that dynamic and how Italians navigate those forces.
Thank you very much. And I think I'd add that the archive can be used in many different ways. I think there was the traditional way of using the archive, but I've been working a lot on investigation documents around crimes, political crimes, fascist crimes, and a lot of that is not what you expect. A lot of it is, there might be photos of houses, and in one of them I even found, and this is one of the most really blew my mind. I was sitting in an archive in Florence. I found bullets that were taken out of a body of someone who died in an attack by fascists on a house. In fact, it was a fascist who died in that case. And they, in the middle of this archive, there were these bullets in an envelope, and I sort of started looking at them, and it was just so. The archive is a cultural thing as well, and so that it's not really an answer to your question about. There are many things that help us understand everyday life, but always have to be. It was always filtered and censored and representational. But there's also the archive is I think often much richer than it's been sometimes used, if in a kind of de Felician way. An archive is just what happened and what the regime wanted, and I think there's a lot more in it. And that's all started. That's where everyday life is really helpful, because it is often about that. So I'd like to thank you very much to our speakers. That was excellent. I really enjoyed that, and it's really interesting and covering such a wide range of things so clearly. And I look forward to seeing the results of their research. I've seen some of it already, but further results and publications down the line. And I'd just like to say that the next and last in the series is on the 16th of December, and we're going to be talking about Squadrismo after Squadrismo, so sort of post 45 and the 70s, and even, very topically, not that long ago, the CGL in Rome was attacked, so not necessarily things from the past. And we're going to have Giorgia Bulli from the University of Florence and Andrea Marmoni, who's just moved, I think, to La Sapienza in Rome. So that should be great. Looking forward to that. So thank you to Josh Arthworth, thank you to Kate Ferris, thanks to Simon Martin, and thanks to British School at Rome. And thanks to everybody who listened as well. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, well done. Thank you.